All right, folks, we are back. This is episode 7 of the English Cybersecurity Podcast. In this podcast, we aim to make cybersecurity understandable for everyone, including you. All right, so we're already on to episode 7, not module 7, episode 7. And we've already kind of gone through all the basics of cybersecurity 101, if you will. And so we're going to try to expand on some of these topics a little bit. So this week, I wanted to talk primarily about, we're going to do a quick recap and review of all the previous episodes. We're going to dive way deeper into advanced threat actors, things like insider threats, nation state, and other threat actors like that. We're also going to talk about cyber kill chain and MITRE attack framework basics. And then we'll even talk about some real world, breach case studies that have happened. And what you can learn from those case studies is pretty substantial, but you'll also see some trends in those case studies. So that's what we're going to primarily focus on today. And we're going to dive into kind of a brief review of what we've gone through so far. We talked about, basic terminology. We talked about some networking basics. Really just tried to lay the groundwork. We talked about best practices, all those kinds of fun things that we talked about in our first 6 episodes. So now we're going to dive deeper into, like I said, the threat actors, the types of, more advanced threat actors, and where they come from and what they typically do and fun stuff like that. So let's just start there. Threat actor is such a funny word, but you'll hear threat actor, you'll hear bad actor, but it all means the same thing. It's a hacker. That's all it means if you boil it all down. And effectively, there's different types of hackers, right? You'll have white hat hackers, black hat hackers, gray hat hackers. You'll hear all these different terms. So white hat is typically a good guy. That's your pen testing firm that you've hired to perform a pen test on your systems. You'll have a black hat hacker who is very much an adversary and is not your friend. And then you have kind of the gray hat. It's a little bit in between. So you'll hear some of those terms, but you'll also find that in some cases, these hackers are script kiddies. And a script kiddie is just a kid, right, running. When they say kiddies, it's not a cat or kittens. It is kids running, these scripts that they find online on GitHub and whatnot on their parents' computer or on some, wherever they are. They always say in your mom's basement. That's the typical threat actor or script kiddie location, is in their parents' basement. But regardless, you'll hear that's one type of attacker, if you will. And those can still be dangerous in a way, but they're not sophisticated enough to do much past initial compromise or initial breach in most cases. Some of those script kiddies are very smart and they can figure it out. That's kind of the flip side there, but the vast majority, they're tinkering around, right? They found something on GitHub and it's like, ooh, I'm going to try this. And it works, and they're like, oh, wait, that worked? So that's typically what the script kiddie terminology consists of. And you'll also hear nation-state threat actors and nation-state hackers. Well, those nation-states are typically North Korea or Russia. The governments of those countries hires people to do nefarious things to other countries, aka hack into their stuff and steal their stuff. So there's lots of different levels of threat actors. You've got the more advanced, threat actor groups. So these teams of hackers, black hat hackers, that will team up together. They'll give themselves some sort of a name, and they're deploying ransomware. They're hacking into anything and everything they can, trying to get that ransomware payday. So that's another form of threat actor or bad actor that you'll hear about as well. And I guess you can call those groups of hackers almost like a criminal organization, but you can also think of other, like, just larger criminal organizations that also employ these hackers to do bad things on their behalf as well. Then you've also got, you probably heard this term before, a hacktivist, or, it's an activist, but it's a hacker. So they hack in the name of some sort of, thing that they're trying to bring awareness to. So, for example, if some hacktivist doesn't like Elon Musk, let's say, that's a hot topic, right, for a lot of people. Well, this hacktivist will try to hack Tesla's website or something, for example, and say, oh, I'm hacking your website because I don't like Elon Musk and, whatever they want to do, right? So those are your hacktivists, and they can be, and sometimes those hacktivists can be good, which is kind of a weird thing to say, but they can be good in a way that in some very rare cases, unfortunately, but in some cases, hacktivists will hack into something to fix the problem that they see, and, rather than leveraging that system to promote whatever ideology they want to, right? They are on the other side of hacktivism where they're trying to prevent someone from getting hacked. So if they find something, ooh, let me go fix this for you, and they fix it for that company, whoever it is, right, so that they don't get hacked. That's almost like a white hat hacker as well, kind of a similar thing, but it's more of a, you're not paying this hacktivist, right? They're doing it on their own, right? So you hear that term a little bit too. You also hear insider threats, which we did talk about a little bit, but that's someone who works at your company, and they could be, a legit employee, right, that has been there for years, and then all of a sudden they become disgruntled. And they start doing malicious things on the network. They start deleting files. They start deleting emails. Whatever it is, you'll hear those types of insider threats, but there's much more advanced insider threats nowadays where, and we saw this with KnowBe4, the phishing training company. KnowBe4 was interviewing a candidate that they thought was, somebody that lives in the United States. Will come to find out they were a nation-state hacker from North Korea. And they figured all this out through a myriad of steps, and you can read about it on their website. So if you go to knowbe4.com, it's KNOW, the letter B, and then 4. You'll see the blog post where they detail and kind of outline how they figured out this interviewee or this candidate was in fact a hacker and from North Korea. So there's those types of insider threats where someone has or is trying to get hired at a company to do something nefarious. Then you also have the insider threats where they've been paid by a criminal organization. So a legit employee gets approached by some sort of criminal organization, and that organization pays this person however much money to, hey, go plug in this USB to someone's computer at your office. And they pay them X amount of money. Well, that allows the criminals into that company's network. So that's typically what you see when someone gets bribed, basically. But that now also becomes, it's kind of a hybrid insider threat, criminal organization threat, right? Or maybe it's a nation state. Either way, those are some of the terms, the threat actor types, if you will, that you'll hear about in the cybersecurity world. So, and there are others too, but that's the vast majority there. But again, there could be some others, and there's new ones coming out all the time. They're making up new acronyms every time I turn around. So there could be some new ones, as soon as this podcast ends. So I also wanted to touch a little bit on emerging threat vectors. So a threat vector, let's start with what is a threat vector, right? A threat vector is a way for someone to get into a system, and typically it's unauthorized activity, right? So you have a method or a way or a vector to gain access to a system that you do not own and that you're not supposed to gain access to. That is a threat vector. So typically that's a thing like a vulnerability, like, hey, you're running a version of Windows that's vulnerable. And because of that, a hacker can exploit that vulnerability and gain access to that system, right? So that's a threat vector. That's a very common one. You'll also see phishing as a threat vector. Any kind of attacks like that are essentially a threat vector. But some of the new things that are coming out nowadays, Deepfakes have been very interesting to see. And all the AI craziness as well. So that's kind of one and the same with AI and deepfakes. But we've seen attacks where, and these get very sophisticated, where they are able to use these deepfakes and AI to create a very convincing voice on a phone call, where they can call someone at that company and pretend like they're the CEO, and all they're doing is they're typing what they want their AI to say, and it sounds just like the CEO, right? That's what these deepfakes are able to do. And they're using social engineering as well. That's been a threat vector for a long time. And again, social engineering is where you're attacking the human. You're attacking a person because, we're human, right? We're a lot easier to trick than a computer. A computer is ones and zeros. It's on or off. But humans, we have emotions. We have feelings. We have all those kinds of variables that computers don't. And therefore, makes it easier to use social engineering techniques to hack a person and gain access to that person's system. So I can socially engineer you by calling you up on the phone and pretending like I'm your help desk and that I need to change your password. And that's just one example. Phishing is also a social engineering technique. There's several others too. You can do in-person social engineering, where you walk into whatever business, you pretend like you're a maintenance person and you try to gain access to an area you're not supposed to. So there's all different types of social engineering, but you're just tricking somebody. That's all it really boils down to. You're hacking the human. So deepfakes are on the rise. The AI-powered, phishing emails and automation. So phishing used to be a little easier to catch because the bad guys would use horrible grammar, bad spelling. It's like, oh, come on, whatever. And some of the phishing emails, let's be real, were very unconvincing for the vast majority of people. Of course, there were a few people that fall for those, yes, but that you have a long-lost brother in some foreign country that wants to give you a bunch of money. Yeah, that's probably not real, right? Like, so those are the things that are obvious to most of us. But I digress. The AI stuff, though, is helping these bad guys craft phishing campaigns, phishing emails that are way more convincing and are free of spelling errors and grammatical errors. So this makes it much harder for the person who's receiving that message to determine if it's real or fake. And this is where you go back to before you click on anything, hover over the links, all those basics. And we'll talk about those too. Regardless, the AI stuff, though, like I said, is really helping the bad guys. It helps the good guys too, but it also helps the bad guys. So it's a double-edged sword there. So we're also seeing not only phishing attacks using AI, but AI-based malware. So the AI is either creating malware, or it is there's some sort of AI in the malware that can do all kinds of nefarious things on your computer. So there's a lot of different ways to slice and dice it, but the point is that this is the reality that we live in now, and these are the emerging threat vectors that we're seeing. And email is still your number one threat vector. I think the latest study was 2021 or 2022 from Deloitte, and it was like 91% of all breaches start with a phishing email. So phishing is still the number one threat vector. However, other social engineering techniques aside from phishing are also very, very popular, very, very easy nowadays with AI and deepfakes and all that. So be on the lookout for those. Okay, so some other fun topics here. I want to talk about some case studies, and there's plenty to look up because these happen every day. There are ransomware attacks happening right now to hundreds of companies, and it's an ongoing issue, right, of course. But some of the case studies that you read are really interesting because you can see where the gaps were in the controls of that business, and so you can try to not make the same mistakes that they did. Some of the most common techniques that you'll see in those case studies, the ransomware folks will gain some sort of initial access, so they'll hack into a person's computer, an externally facing system that was vulnerable, whatever it is, they get that initial access point. Once they've got the initial access point, they attempt to what we call move laterally or hack into other systems. And once they've done that and they've gained a much stronger foothold, they're going to try to elevate their permissions or their privileges. And what does that mean? So if I am John Smith and I'm a regular user on the network, I don't have a lot of permissions to make a lot of large scale changes either on my computer or on other computers. Whereas if you are, an administrator, there's a lot more things that you can do. So what the hackers will attempt to do is once they gain the initial access, they try to move laterally and escalate privileges. That escalation of privilege is basically where they try to take, any kind of administrator password hash and crack it. And you can find passwords in a lot of different places. People do not typically store passwords securely. So if these threat actors or these hackers get into a system, they're going to start looking for the keyword password. They're going to start looking in your web browser for passwords stored there. They're going to look at Word documents or Excel documents with potential passwords in them, or text documents, right? Anything of that nature. They'll also look in your Windows directory. If you're part of an Active Directory domain, there's a sysvol folder on your system that may contain a script, and if the administrators were careless and they put a password in that script, a password for the domain and that domain administrator account, then that's where you can escalate your privileges. So the bad guys know in all the places to look. They're gonna try to grab all of the password hashes that they can, start cracking those password hashes and cracking those passwords. If they are successful cracking those passwords, they will then start trying to use those accounts, and they're able to figure out what privileges those accounts have, log into other systems, dump more password hashes, crack those too, and they will get to a point where they can finally elevate their permissions and their privileges to become an administrator on your network. That is where it gets really scary, because now you've got a bad guy in your network who is, basically an administrator, and they can do whatever they want. So these are and then from there, by the way, once they're done elevating permissions, gaining a bunch of access to things, they will start encrypting your data. And then, before they encrypt, they'll probably exfil or steal your data, and then they will encrypt. So that way they've got a copy of all your data, and they can hold you hostage or hold you ransom after they encrypt your data. So if you read a lot of those case studies, and there's plenty, you can just go to all the cybersecurity news websites too. There's plenty of articles out there. And in a lot of those, they will detail, where the weakness was. But in some cases, they don't. But you can read between the lines. If it's ransomware, they got in some sort of initial access, moved laterally, escalated privileges, stole data, then encrypted files. That's the typical path that they take in all those case studies. So you can learn a lot from those. They do get repetitive, though, because the bad guys are doing the same things over and over and over. So it's once you know their techniques, you can at least you're trying to think like they do, right? And figure out, okay, if I was them, what would I do? What would I try to hack into, and try to prevent it before it happens. Now that's easier said than done in a lot of cases, but we won't get into that. But there's just a lot of different case studies out there. There's just basic phishing case studies that you can read up on about how that all works, how they craft these messages, how they're able to send out all these messages, where do they get the email addresses to send to. All those kinds of things are in those case studies, so you can read up on those. Okay, some other fun topics here. The cyber kill chain. We got all these fancy terms for things. The cyber kill chain. So the cyber kill chain is something that, as a defender, it is great to know and understand, because you can use that to, again, think like the hacker would and understand kind of how do you break the chain of events, right? How do you, break the kill chain? You kill whatever that bad guy is trying to do. You stop them in their tracks, right? There's 7 stages of an attack, and you can read up about the cyber kill chain framework on the internet. You can just Google it, Cyber Kill Chain Framework. You'll find it. But the 7 stages of an attack are typically, in this order: reconnaissance. Reconnaissance is where you're going out and, just like you would if you're in the military, you're trying to gather information, right, about whoever you're trying to hack into. You then have weaponization, where you then try to create some sort of either phishing email or malware to target this company with, or some sort of exploitation of a vulnerability that you found during your recon. Then you have the third stage is delivery. So that's where you actually execute your malware. You send out your phishing email, whatever it is. You have exploitation, which is where you take advantage of that initial access that you gained after delivery. So you've exploited either the person via the phishing email, you've exploited the vulnerability, you've gained access. And then step 5 is your installation. So what they're typically going to do is they're going to install all of their malicious tools to allow them to have a backdoor into that system and into your network. So they'll install, VPN tunnels. They'll install any kind of backdoor remote access Trojan, whatever it is that they can. So that way they can regain access to that system whenever they want to. And they can go take a nap, and they can go get dinner, and sleep for the night, whatever it is, right? And then from there, once they install all their bad stuff, they typically do what's called command and control. So this is where they are able to send commands to that system where they've installed all their bad stuff on and control it remotely. So these bad guys could be anywhere in the world. They could be a script kiddie in their mom's basement, like we talked about, or they could be a nation-state threat actor from North Korea or Russia or China or wherever. So they do command and control. They've gained access, right? They've installed their stuff. They're able to command and control that system, and then they perform their actions on objectives. And typically, like I said just previously, their objectives are to gain access, move laterally, elevate privileges, steal data, encrypt your data. And even nowadays, they're even going so far as, and I didn't mention this earlier, they're going so far as to try to delete your backups and delete any kind of method for you to restore your systems. So this is another common objective of the bad guys. But read up on that cyber kill chain framework, and also read on how would you break the chain at each stage of that. And that framework does kind of break that down for you. It's a lot to run through in a 30-minute podcast, so I won't dive too much deeper into that specifically. I did want to touch on MITRE framework first, but please go read up on that cyber kill chain. If you're going to be a defender, you're going to want to know how do you defend, how do you break that chain. So read up on that. And then the other big topic of today was the MITRE attack framework. And so this is an extremely comprehensive framework that's been developed here, and it's almost overwhelming to look at initially. When you very first open up the MITRE attack framework, it's like, whoa, holy smokes, there is a lot of stuff to look at here. It's basically all the different attack vectors, threat vectors, the processes that they go through, the techniques, the tactics, the procedures. I mean, it is wild how much that they've documented in all of these. So that MITRE attack framework is really cool because you can map your security controls to that MITRE attack framework. So you can say, oh, I see this type of attack here. Okay, if I implement this control, I can now prevent this attack in that MITRE attack framework. So it's got a lot of different attacks, right? It's a lot to try to tackle at once, and I don't recommend doing it all at once. Take bite-sized pieces if this is going to be part of your daily job. But it's great to have this information and be able to map it back to your controls that you have, because that'll also help you determine where you have a gap or a weakness in those controls that you're going to want to improve on, right? So this is a great way to, kind of check what controls you have against this attack framework and then figure out where do I need to improve. Similar kind of thing to like a NIST framework, but NIST is a lot more generalized, I would say. But it is good to map your controls to both the NIST framework and the MITRE attack framework if you can. But either way, highly recommend reading up on that MITRE attack framework and the NIST framework as well. These are like the big industry standards. The NIST framework is massive. ISO 27001 is the other big framework that's typically used overseas. But NIST and ISO are very, very, very similar in their frameworks. But the MITRE attack framework is very specific to cyber attacks. And so it's great to kind of see where you stack up against all those different types of attacks. Okay, that's, I think, as far as we're going to get today. And I know we've got a few more things to cover, but I do want to try to keep these podcasts to around 30 minutes. So we're going to stop for now, and we will pick this back up next week, and we will continue on with threat intelligence basics and dive into a bunch of other topics too. But we'll cross that bridge when we get there next week. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and we'll talk again soon.